tools and techniques you can use to communicate that story. Sometimes indeed it may be a highly analytical presentation. Sometimes it just may be a piece of paper. Sometimes it may be just talking to someone one-on-one. And I actually think communication is something we don't do a great job of teaching in business school. And as you mentioned, if the IT professionals who haven't been to business school, I'd say, look, you're not missing out on much by in terms of learning communication. But the best way I've found of learning about communication is watch people in action. Watch people who are really good at communicating. So, and there are many people from diverse fields of life. So Steve Jobs was a master communicator. He was one of the best out there. And if you observe some of his presentations, he doesn't have huge facts and figures. He's not reading slides. He's just driving really compelling messaging, using impressive metaphors, making connections. And I think by watching people, by practicing, and I think a lot of it, I hate to sound like a broken record, but to me, the core of communication is before you jump into the communication, do you know who your audience or stakeholders are? What are they? What's on their mind? What are you trying to get out of that piece of communication? So for me, communication is less in the delivery, more in the planning of how you're going to think about that particular interaction. So I actually think it's a big need gap today in corporate India of how we can get people to communicate effectively and honestly free up a lot of the time that goes into rituals of preparing big decks when they may or may not be needed.
Absolutely. So storytelling was one thing, knowing your audience was another takeaway, and planning rather than the process of, so three things that here that I can take away. And actually when I see this even across the world, having sort of worked in many geographies myself, especially for people from the Western world, very often Indians have a lot of substance, but they're not in that business of, sharing that. Whereas a lot of the Western education is built on, expressing and talking and convincing. And I think, besides the new breed of technical leaders who've sort of come up, and of course, Indians have worked very hard, but there's a lot of them who end up taking slightly, what I would say, a little below their potential. They never sort of, and our culture also teaches us, not to be overly, flamboyant, or that's not part of our, basic inheritance. So what's your advice? How do people, have you seen, across, in your own experience, what should people do to sort of break this?
No, I think the first realization people need to have is, projecting yourself is not a bad thing. I think sometimes, culturally, there is this whole thing of it shouldn't be form over substance. I'm going to work hard. I'll be noticed for it. That's true. But as I was saying earlier, that's kind of the point of parity or table stakes. Of course, it's a huge asset to have, to be smart, to work hard, to always strive to do your best. The reality is, if nobody notices or knows, it really doesn't matter. Whether you're selling a brand or whether you're trying to build your career, but that doesn't mean you need to change who you are. You need to, become fake. But the whole idea is, how do you just be conscious of key moments of truth when it's important for you to show up and be noticed? I think just that consciousness that, you're meeting an important stakeholder, you're meeting a senior leader. Just don't walk in and say, this is all I'm doing. Just be conscious of, this is an important moment of truth. This is a time when people will evaluate me, and then plan for it, be thoughtful about it. The other part I'd say is, I think about, you mentioned education. I feel people get better at some of these skills when they develop interests outside their work at an early age. It goes even in school, right? I have a 14-year-old son, and he's really into debating. I was big time into debating and quizzing when I was younger, because I think, of course, we all have to study and we have to get good grades, but there are many things you can do, and it could be leadership in sports teams, it could be involvement in organizations, and as people get into the workforce, I think it's important to have a part of your mind that's always learning and building skills beyond just the projects you're working on. That could take the form, in a corporate context of, are you involved in employee groups? Are you involved in organizing things beyond just your core job? Because I think those building communication skills is like building any muscle. You're not going to build it one day by waking up and working in the gym. It's continual practice. It's working on it. And I think that's where I feel people, when they talk about communication or projecting themselves, find opportunities to do it every day. And over time, you're going to build it.
Okay, great. So, some takeaways there is it's not a one-day thing. Keep making that effort. The other thing I picked up was, try and develop interest beyond the workplace. So, you get a chance. Exercise, right? And you'll obviously get better at it. Now, tell me, you brought out an interesting, you worked in so many geographies with different bosses. I wonder if I'm sure, come across some bosses love to hear rather than, and some people are very report oriented, send them a written deck. They want to read it before, and, it's all different types, right? So what tips do you have for, employees who are working with managers, especially when suddenly start working across geographies? Because culturally people are different, sometimes, and their work styles are different. So how does one navigate, bosses?
No, it's a really good question, because I think one of the blind spots for any executive is all of us get conditioned to working in a certain way or being comfortable working with bosses in a certain ways. When we encounter people with very different styles or very different expectations, it can really throw people off. The biggest tip I would have is, before you jump into any professional relationship, and this is true of bosses, this is equally true of your team members, how do you invest the time to really understand who they are, what their operating style is, what works for them, how they define success? And I think, sometimes having those conversations early on really helps provide a framework to that relationship. So I've worked with all kinds of bosses. I've worked with bosses who've said, look, I don't want to see any details. You just tell me big picture, what's going on, ask me for help. I've also worked with bosses who want to see a detailed update on everything. That's okay. The first is to understand that. The second is not just to blindly follow it, because I think that's not our job as leaders either, is to have that dialogue early on not just what the boss wants, but equally it's our job to help the bosses understand, what does your team need to succeed? Because sometimes when you have a new leader, success isn't just making the boss happy. And for me, the leader's job is really helping a new manager understand, hey, this is what my team needs for success. And this is how I need you as a leader to help. So sometimes I have asked managers, I need you to be more hands-on because I'm dealing with certain crises. And other times I've told my managers, okay, I want you to be a bit more hands-off because this is what I'm trying to do. So I think it's a process of dialogue. It's not just passively following a style, but it really starts with, it's not about the boss and you. It's ultimately about your business and your team. What kind of leadership is going to help that team succeed at that point in time? Have an alignment with the boss. It's almost like, ideally, my best relationships with managers have been when it's been so transparent that we're saying, these are the roles you and I will play to help the team succeed. This is where I need your help. These are areas where I'm going to drive it. This is where I need you to be bad cop. This is where I need you to be good cop. And I think if you can build that level of trust and transparency, I think then the two of you can really work in concert to help the team succeed.
Mm-hmm. No, very true, very true. I mean, it's amazing the way you say it. If you've been able to build that level of trust, and where people can express so freely, that's amazing. But a lot of people actually, I know, struggle with this, as in they don't know, or they've sort of, it's almost like saying what got you here won't get you there,
Yeah.
Because you worked in a particular way and then the scenario changes.
And I think, one of the unlocks there for me with it is, never make it about yourself or your success. It doesn't matter. I see myself as almost incidental to the piece. I will succeed when my team succeeds and performs. So I think a lot of leaders get hung up on, how do I work with my boss? It's irrelevant. How can you and your boss help your team succeed? Because then it takes a lot of your personal ego, your personal baggage out of the equation. Because I think where people struggle is, well, I work in a certain way, I'm struggling to adapt. It doesn't matter. You need to adapt. If you need to adapt to help your team succeed, you need to adapt. And it's tough to do, but for me, that's one of the core parts of the journey of leadership, is at some point, you take your own ego, your own success out of the picture. Your success is an outcome of the team performing, and you're focusing on helping the team perform.
Okay, great. So I think it's really, like you said, get your own ego out of the way and see the larger picture of being, part of the wheel, but as a leader, enabling the wheel to function.
Absolutely.
Oh, fantastic. That's a great way of, There are very often I've seen, I don't know how, if you've seen in various environments, right? Typically, in a lot of Western companies, specifically, right? So, your first 9 months, the results, there's a run rate that you calculate, and, so there's you project that, okay, this is what you've done, this is how you'll end. Nobody waits for the end to happen, because bonus projections have to be done, and the pot has to get distributed. And for a long time, a lot of companies were using the so-called bell curve, right?
Yeah.
Where there are certain buckets where the top 20% will be this, and then there is a large majority. So very often your rating is decided a lot before. I don't know if it's happened. You've gone through that, but
absolutely,
a lot of rating is already done, which a lot of young, unsuspecting people don't know that this happens only when you reach a certain level. You figure that. So if you've already decided, right? So what chance does does a manager whose rating has already been decided have in an appraisal to sort of make any change or difference? How would you suggest they tackle that?
I think the biggest thing is to not think of a rating or an appraisal or a performance discussion as a one-time event that happens at a certain point in the year. I think the best advice is to think of it as an always-on conversation you're having with your managers, your stakeholders. You need to be acutely aware of where you're tracking. It's not a question of waking up, and it's besides the point whether it's month 9 or month 12. If you're waking up at that point in the year and saying, oh my God, why am I rated X? You're already late to the party. I think so. For me, a lot of it is having continuous feedback, having transparent sharing of what the results are. So you're both taking on board feedback to improve, you're taking on board ideas, you're taking corrective action. Equally, you're transparently sharing the context of the results. So, you might be having a rough year, but there might be a perfectly understandable context to it. Something may have happened externally, there may be something outside your locus of control. You're telling your stakeholders about it so they know. Equally, you're taking their help. The worst thing that happens in any performance conversation is, for the employee standpoint, when the person is completely surprised because they've never had these conversations. And from a manager standpoint, when you've never actually told that employee ever through the year that things are off track, and one day you land a rating on them. Both ways, it's wrong. And, for me, I think every person should have a regular cadence of conversations, which, I don't know, figure out the frequency that works for you. Probably you don't need to talk this every week, but take a step back from here's what's happening on my work to saying, hey, give me feedback. What's working, what's not working? Let me give you context on how I feel about how things are going. See if there's any big misalignments in perceptions about how you're going, get feedback. I think that's the best way of not making it a surprise.
Absolutely. So I think you described the ideal process very well, where both the manager keeps telling people on the job across at various points, and employees also keep checking. Unfortunately, the world hasn't always been so.
Yeah, but Mudit, what I believe is, I know I may sound like an idealist here. If a manager doesn't do this, they're a bad manager. I'm quite binary on this, right? Because once you start leading people, a core part of your responsibility is helping your people succeed. If you're not doing that, you're not a good manager. So I think as leaders, it's setting those expectations of people managers, that you may be wonderful at your work individually, but if you aren't doing this, you're not a good manager. And equally, I think encouraging younger employees to have these conversations, creating a safe space for them, not just wait for the hierarchical chain of command and performance appraisal. Make it okay for them to ask for feedback, share feedback. And I think that's something which I think leaders can do to enable this.
No, absolutely. So it's always such a pleasure when it happens regularly, and like you said, both people pursue the roles. So that's perfect. But we're also now witnessing a very different world, in the sense that, and I'm not just referring to the Great Resignation as such, but I'm saying that even in India, right? I mean, look back when we started off in our careers, we didn't have a lot of these startups that were so well funded, right? Today, a startup can, that's well funded, can choose to pay beyond all norms. And you worked in a structured organization, where that there's a band, right? Every grade has a band. and you have to operate somewhere at a particular, every role is pegged, etc. So what do organized companies who are so well structured and large in this thing, how do they deal with, external companies, coming in and poaching talent? I don't know if you felt it, but it seems to be happening a lot around.
I think the talent market has changed a lot, since I guess, we began our careers. And I think many things have changed. One is obviously newer opportunities, with, as you mentioned, new sectors opening up. I think the second big thing that's changed in the talent market is the role technology's played in just disrupting how work gets done, how people relate with each other. I think younger employees of today expect much more flexibility, expect much more, I'd say, flatter organizations where there's more free communication. And I think the third thing that's also changed, especially if you think about a lot of work that's out there on Gen Z, which I've also seen at the workplaces, people today want to work in organizations whose purpose and values really match with them. That's much more important now, much more articulated now than it perhaps was earlier. And I think that's probably a function of, when we were growing up, I came from a very solidly middle-class family. The whole idea was, look, you're building your career, you're getting a good job. I think now a lot of younger people, and I see that as a big positive, are asking different questions. What's the environmental footprint of this organization? What are the values of this organization? And I think as I think about any organization looking to attract or retain talent, it has to be across all these variables. Money is one part of the puzzle, right? Money is definitely one part of the puzzle, but equally, even for a large organization or a large multinational, are you providing people empowerment? Are you providing people an opportunity to work in an environment where they don't feel like a small cog in the wheel? Are you providing people an inspiring workplace where they're clear about what the purpose is? Those are things which I think every organization should do. And if anything, I think the advent of smaller disruptive organizations should teach larger organizations that these are things we should probably move along. I mean, if I think about when I began my career, I'm sure it was the same for you. Senior leadership sits on a different floor, managing directors, this inaccessible, godlike figure who's in a corner somewhere. We don't live in that world now. Our younger employees don't even expect that world or even respect that world now. So I think if organizations can provide some of that flexibility, empowerment, transparency that a lot of smaller organizations provide, a clear sense of purpose, I feel that levels the playing field to a large extent, because then people are not deselecting you because you're this big bureaucratic organization versus the empowerment they might get somewhere else.
So I think organizations are changing also, like you're saying.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
It's nothing like competition, technology, and disruption to make any organization move, right? To do that. So great. I think that's great to see that if people are huge organizations are sort of churning around and doing that. But okay, one other thing that just allied with this is that I found that because of this so-called choice available, right? People have options much more than they had when we were sort of growing up into it. Now, a lot of them don't know very often that a lot of their future is getting decided behind, they don't have access to it, right? So what is somebody like a CEO like you, right? So let's break this into two parts. There is a middle manager who's making the next step, and there is a CXO who's looking for the next big role within the country or outside. So let's take them in two separate. How does, what truly determines, how do you, when you probably sit through in a performance management or a promotion, what would you look at, right? So let's look at for the middle management who wants to get to CXO level first. What decides, you have a whole pool of people, and what decides, how do you decide who moves up?
Now, I guess in both cases, I think broadly the answer is the same. The specific vectors or variables may be slightly different, but I think the biggest question that leaders think about is this person just good at delivering what they're doing today, or do they have the potential to do more? So, for a middle manager aspiring to be a CXO, typically the questions are, assume that there are 5 middle managers who are all equally good at performing today. I think the big questions that often, I think about are, can this person really look at the bigger picture in terms of beyond their functional or role silo? Because when you're a CXO, you end up playing two roles. You may play your functional role, but you also have an enterprise role. And taking on that enterprise role means you're able to think beyond your functional silo, think of the whole organization, not just bracket yourself as I'm the sales guy or I'm the marketing guy, but say, that's the expertise I bring to the table, but I'm a group of leaders who's driving an overall organizational agenda. That requires a fundamental reset in your mind. And the markers I would look for is middle managers who at an early stage in their career are demonstrating that, either getting involved in organizational change management efforts, being, vocal advocates of things beyond their narrow span of control, volunteering to take part in projects which go outside their comfort zone. Those are all great markers for people who are hungry to have broader impact than, the narrow role scope they have. I think the second thing which I always look for, for middle managers getting to CXOs is, business is a team sport. When you're leading an organization and you have a bunch of CXOs, it's how do you constructively challenge each other? At the same time, how do you find common ground? How do you drive a certain direction through the organization? And the core parts of that are how are you able to influence? How are you able to communicate? How are you able to constructively work through conflict? So that's the other part which I often look for is, the worst dimension of this is someone who is keen to succeed for themselves and, gets into negative politics and it's finger pointing. The best are people who are able to manage conflict constructively or deal with failure constructively. So what I often look at younger managers is when something's gone wrong, how are they reacting? Are they blaming someone else? Or are they taking accountability? Are they trying to find solutions? Are they trying to bring people together at a time of crisis? Those for me are all great markers for somebody who could succeed as a CXO. So those are things I look at. And as you looked at somebody who's already a CXO and, looking to move beyond, I think the biggest part, I mean, my earliest lesson as a managing director, I've been a managing director now for, I guess, 7 odd years, is when you are truly leading an organization. I think the biggest lesson I learned very early on in that journey is your mind needs to almost be like a rubber band. You have to stretch it in many different directions. As I said, you might be talking deep, 5-year innovation plans. The other day, you could be walking with the sales team talking about the here and now. You might be dealing with people issues. Is if you really are a CXO who aspires to get into that level, is you have to build your curiosity beyond your domain expertise. Be curious about the organization in totality. Learn about all aspects of the organization. Second is, how do you really build your ability to connect with people across the organization at all different levels, not just people like you. When you're a functional leader, chances are you're spending a lot of time talking with, growing along people like you with similar backgrounds, similar experiences. So those are, I think, some of the things I would look for in a CXO who aspires to get to the next level. Is, are they truly demonstrating that curiosity? Are they wanting to learn about things? So I if I think of HR leaders, I love HR leaders who are getting their hands dirty and walking with the sales team because they're understanding the reality of what's happening rather than sitting in the boardroom and looking at a chart on sales productivity, or a finance leader who's actually going to the plant to actually understand how operations are happening rather than looking at the outcome of costs on a spreadsheet. I think that level of curiosity, wanting to build bridges across the organization, are what often markers are for CXOs who can go beyond.
So amazing. So, I've really taken away is a curiosity, taking a larger sort of a multifunctional approach, trying to figure out, not just being a domain expert, but seeing how, the impact of larger organizations. And you also mentioned 3 things that you look for that I sort of took away. One was, how does somebody manage conflict? 2, office politics. 3, accountability, right? And what are the learnings that he's taking away? Because some of these things are really, I keep getting asked as a coach very often, so how do you manage conflict? What's the best way that because you're functionally, if you look at it, see, I see conflict, I wouldn't say there's conflict, but resources are scarce and they have to get allocated in the best possible way so that the organization wins. Yeah. So fundamentally, and there are different, like a risk function is completely opposed to a sales function, right? They're supposed to do two different tasks, but at the end of the day, it sort of works. So what is your advice on managing politics? I mean, sorry, let's start with managing conflict, then we'll come to the next.
No, I guess the first thing is not all conflict is bad. Let's start with that. An organization where everybody agrees on everything is a dangerous organization, because chances are everyone's an echo chamber for the leader. You're not getting diverse points of view. You are likely to fail. I think what's important is, why is the conflict happening and how is that getting managed? If the conflict is happening because different people in the team are trying to drive success but are acting as checks and balances on each other, like you mentioned, or are bringing about different ideas on how to achieve success, that conflict should be encouraged, because then you're bringing on board diverse points of view. And I think as a leader, it's really important to have devil's advocates in the team. If everybody just does what you say, you are set up for failure. So I think that's, on the other hand, if conflict is happening because it's people's egos at play, somebody wants to undermine another leader, somebody wants to look good personally, their agenda is, their function needs to look good, you need to nip that in the bud. That is counterproductive conflict. I think the second part is, when positive conflict emerges, how as a leader are you able to steer that in terms of the outcomes it leads to, which is even positive conflict should not just mean endless debates for months on end. I think it's, how do you quickly find common ground, help people understand that points of view have been taken on board, but then commit to a course of action. I think that's really important, because no organization will succeed by being a continuous debating society. At some point, I think good teams need to say, hey, let's agree, disagree, but commit. And a good enabler of that is having that environment where people are able to express their views, have those debates, but then drive closure and have the whole team commit to it. So I think that's where, for me, when I see conflict coming, because, it's people finger pointing, people trying to score political brownie points, I just ruthlessly nip it in the bud. But I very positively encourage diverse points of view, somebody who's being devil's advocate, somebody, to your point, somebody who's saying, hey, this is the risk I see. And I say, it's great, put that on the table, because otherwise we may miss it. It may be a blind spot for us.
Okay, great. So I took away two things. One is, conflict doesn't have to be bad. It's a type of conflict. If it's negative, etc., nip it in the bud. But if it's positive and it encourages a diverse point of view, entertain it. So great learning there. Now, like you said, at least I feel it's the senior management or the CEO who decides the level of politics. Very, very assigned. If he plays the game, then everybody loves playing the game themselves. But in a lot of places which are not the ideal, I have a lot of managers, middle managers, etc. A lot of people just getting completely stressed out and absolutely disgruntled with the way things are. And what's your advice in terms of, because wherever there are people, there will be diverse views, and unfortunately, I don't know what it is, whether it's a endemic thing, but across the world there will be different camps and there will be politics of sorts. What is your advice to executives on how to deal with this?
I guess the first thing I'd say is, the same advice doesn't work for everyone. I think it comes back a bit to this point of self-awareness. Is a person aware of the environments they thrive in, the kind of work they enjoy, the kind of people they work along with? So for me, a lot of these questions, unfortunately, people ask when they've joined an organization and they're figuring out they're not a good fit. So for me, a lot of it starts with, if you ask those questions early enough, chances are when opportunities come your way, you're asking those questions. So, personally in my journey, I have passed on numerous opportunities, not because they weren't great job designations or the compensation wasn't great. It was because as I asked these questions, I figured out, I'm not judging good or bad. It takes all sorts to make the world, but I figured it probably wouldn't be the right fit for me in terms of how work gets done, the kind of leadership style that's rewarded, the way people engage with each other. And I think the first advice I'd give is for people to ask these questions beforehand as they're considering opportunities. I think the second thing is, if you're in an organization, and let's say you're finding yourself in an environment where it feels like it's not a good fit, or you have a leader or a team, is to ask yourself, is that an organizational issue or is that a team or individual issue? If it is an organizational issue, genuinely, you are not likely to succeed. Fundamentally, if an organization itself, as part of its ethos, works in a certain way, which is completely counter to how you want to work, you're probably not going to have a successful long-term career. Doesn't mean you quit tomorrow, but you really need to have that question and think through. On the other hand, if it's a team or individual issue, I always say seek help. Enlarge your network beyond your immediate manager, which is why I think mentors become so critical in our career journey. Have people with whom you can talk about how you're feeling, get advice on how to navigate it, really, and even understand the broader organization. For all you know, it might be endemic to that particular team, but the broader organization may actually be very different. How could you tap into it? How could you unlock opportunities? So that's, I think, some of the advice I'd give.
Yeah, so very good. I mean, you've obviously taken a very proactive approach of doing the homework upfront, that saves you. And but once people get into it, not everybody is sort of so adept, because sometimes it's the allure of, like you said, right? Somebody who's not very well aligned to his own values may not see maybe the money or the position or whatever, or an opportunity might seem, because the organization in front is obviously going to do the best job of selling it to you.
Absolutely. No,
So,
and I think one thing I've learned, Mudit, is as I've mentored and coached a number of young people, it's sometimes simple things like equipping them with what question should they ask in an interview. Because what happens is people often, especially younger people, they assume an interview is a one-way street. They will ask questions, I will answer. And sometimes it's very powerful when people go in equipped with questions to ask. Simple things like, what kind of leadership skills do you look for? Who are the typical leaders who succeed? How does this organization deal with failure? Describe a day in the life of team members. Different questions which give you a sense of what kind of, and obviously any organization will probably put its best foot forward, but at least you're getting a chance to ask those questions. And obviously in today's day and age, Mudit, where so many people are connected within a few degrees on social media or through networks, finding out through networks of people who either have experience of that organization, have worked in it, worked with it. So I think there's no substitute for doing that homework, but it comes back to the questions you're asking.
Absolutely. Very well said. But there's something more you mentioned there, is in terms of mentors. For a lot of organizations where there isn't a formal system of assigning a mentor or a buddy or somebody there of that sort, how would you encourage executives to find and build those connections to get mentorship, if it's not formally a part of it? How do they do that?
For me, it's almost incidental whether it's formalized or not. I have honestly not had even a single formal mentor assigned to me, but I've had amazing mentoring relationships with a number of people in my career. I'd always recommend to anyone, don't think of a mentor as one silver bullet who'll solve all your problems in life. Ideally, have a set of mentors. It starts with you understanding what are areas you want to grow in or need help in. So ideally, have a mentor who has nothing to do with your day job. But somebody who can help you with leadership advice, somebody who can help you grow in an area you want to grow in. I think that's important for all of us to have somebody who can be a sounding board. I think it's powerful to have a mentor in the organization as well. But again, don't assume it has to be somebody in your reporting line. Sometimes the most powerful mentors are people who aren't seeing the world the same way you are, or are in the same thing. And I'd say just reach out. I think the reality of the world is there are more good people than bad. Most people fundamentally are decent people who are trying to do well and help others. I have rarely encountered when people have reached out to leaders. Leaders have said, no, I don't have time. I think just reach out, ask for help. And the important thing with mentoring is don't see it as a transaction. I think that's really off-putting for a lot of mentors. When somebody reaches out saying, I need this specific help, mentoring is all about committing to a relationship. It's about genuinely getting to know people, building a relationship over time. That takes time. And I think it's seeing that as important and investing in it is something a lot of people don't do. So mentoring is not reaching out to somebody and asking for a reference check for a new job. Somebody will do that for you, but that's not mentoring. Mentoring is building that relationship over time, using your mentors as sounding boards, genuinely being open to feedback. I think that's what I'd encourage people to do. Have a network of mentors from different parts of your life, and really use them as ongoing sounding boards.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying, I heard is, take time to build those relationships.
Exactly.
Right. Because it's not when you're in trouble, then you suddenly sort of reach out.
Exactly.
Right.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a great tip for a lot of people in terms of building these relationships. I mean, how would you tell them to get started? Is it, trying to build these conversations or, asking for help? Should they send an email? How would they get started? Because this is an important thing for a lot
I
of
think
people.
it all depends on what area you need help in. So first it starts with if you need help in a particular area or in navigating a certain part of your career, just being clear on what you need help on, identifying who might be able to help. Just think through that. Don't just seek out mentors because they have a senior job designation. That because sometimes what people do is let me just seek out a mentor who seems quote unquote senior in the organization. Figure out what area you need help in. Then I think it's just a question of reaching out. Depending on the organization, if you're in the same location, reaching out, having a conversation, setting up some time, saying you need help, introducing yourself. I think it's as simple as that. Just taking that first step, which I think requires courage, requires vulnerability because you're reaching out. But I think you need to take that first step. And sometimes I think you don't even need to say, I need you to be a mentor. It's just starting that conversation, having a follow-on conversation. Sometimes the best mentoring relationships are those which build organically. And then establishing a certain cadence of how you're going to be in touch, which works for both of you, and then getting that relationship going. So don't even start the conversation with, can you be my mentor? But start with, this is who I am. These are things that are on my mind. These are areas I was wondering if you could help me with, frame my thinking on. Start the conversation, have a follow on, and take it from there. You may have a set of really enriching conversations, and that person may not be a long-term mentor. On the other hand, that person could be a mentor for years on end, but let it build organically.
So build organically and reach out, right? Two
Yeah,
takeaways that I would. And you brought out one interesting thing is that, let's say, for example, reaching out, right? So, as a CEO, you meet a young, executive in the same lift, somebody who just joined. What's your advice? A lot of them don't know what to say, and there's like silence when the lift goes down. What is your advice to people when they meet senior people in the lift or anywhere else? What should they do?
The first thing I'd say is, don't react to people because they're senior or junior. We're all human beings. I think take away that whole filter of levels and layers, and I'd say just engage as people, right? I mean, if hypothetically you're in the same lift, say hi, ask them how their day has been. Just normal conversation you'd have with anyone, and it's the same for leaders. I think the old school leader is inaccessible, stiff upper lip. Sure, just engaging as human beings, right? Just have a conversation like you would with anyone else, establish a connection. And I think in today's day and age, in a world, if you think of, this corporate stereotype of, a leader versus a junior employee, in the real world, none of that matters. All of us have the same share of voice on Twitter. All of us have the same share of voice on LinkedIn. The world is being leveled by technology. And I think people who embrace that, who are able to have real conversations as people, I think will get the most out of any such interaction.
Very good. So we've talked a lot about, as we sort of reach the top of the hour, a little bit more about yourself, because you spoke a lot about self-awareness and so what reflective practices do you have, that helps you tune in very clearly to this self-awareness?
I don't do a lot. What I do, Mudrit, is every morning, typically I'll run. And that's a time when I'm really thinking through stuff in my mind about work, about stuff happening in life. If I'm working on a book, about the book. So I'll run for, an average 1.5 hours or so. And that's time when I'm blanked out from distractions. And I think through different things. But that's really my time to reflect, plan, introspect. That's really my me time. And then I think of, this is what I'm going to do today on all fronts. And that in a way kind of kickstarts my day.
Oh, amazing. Amazing. So this is, that long run. So firstly, obviously you've been at it for a while to run for 1.5 hours. So well done for that. The other thing is just on a personal note, so you've done so many different things, worked in different organizations, countries, etc. You write, from what I know, you're into karate, etc. What do you truly think is, one is your next step in life? What would you like to do? One is just the larger purpose of life. What would you, if I could take you there for a minute?
No, sure. Thanks for asking. I guess if I think of purpose, I've never written it down as this is my purpose statement, but I feel all of us are put on this earth with a limited period of time given to us. And I feel we should all use that time to see if we can make things better for others around us. So, that's a unifying theme across my life, across all the things I do with my life, which is in the corporate world, how do I leave behind stronger organizations, stronger brands, stronger businesses, people who are succeeding in their careers? In my personal life, how do I leave behind great memories, values, so that my son grows up to be a great young man, my wife feels that, we're building a great life together. In my writing, how do I positively impact readers with my ideas and stories so that, maybe long after I'm gone, those ideas and stories leave behind. So that's kind of the unifying theme, which is, I think all of us have an opportunity to impact others positively. And that's something which really drives me in everything I do.
Great. So it's really about impacting others in different parts.
Impacting others and leaving a lasting impact.
A lasting
which
impact.
is going to, live on long after you're no longer in the role, no longer in the company, no longer in the world potentially. But, how do you leave an impact that's going to last beyond your tenure and keep on positively impacting people?
Perfect. So I'm sure you've left a great impact. This is being live streamed across the world, and I'm sure, it's really, really been very helpful. Thank you so much, Moinak, for your time. And thank you once again. Really, it's been real gems of wisdom, and I look forward to, keeping in touch with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mudit, for having me over. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And
bye.
Bye.